Hey guys, this is Charles Yeager for RocketStock. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a military drone look in After Effects. Let's go ahead and preview the final effect. Now before we get started, I do want to mention that you can download the project file for this tutorial from the blog post from RocketStock.com. So make sure you head over there and grab that. The project includes the same drone footage I'll be using, as well as some other free assets like camera overlays and even some accent sound effects. Alright, let's get started building the look. Alright, so inside of After Effects, I've already got my drone footage added into a composition. You can see just a circular shot of this Jeep in a field. And the first step we need to do is we need to camera track this footage. So I'm just going to select that footage, and then you'll see I have the tracker options here. We're going to do the track camera feature. If you don't see this window, just come over here to window and then go down to tracker, and that'll open that up. And so again, with the footage selected, I'm going to select track camera, and that's just going to camera track this footage. This usually takes about a minute or two for this clip, so I'm going to go ahead and fast forward to when this is finished. Alright, so that's finished calculating here. We can go ahead and move on the timeline. You can see all the different tracker points we have on the footage. And before we move on, I'm just going to come over here and find an area that looks relatively flat. I'm just going to right click, and I'm going to select to create a null and a camera. Now the main reason we track this footage is we just need the tracker points kind of for a visual effect. However, if you do want to add other objects in and track them to the scene, you can now do that with the camera and the null. I'm just going to select the null, hit scale, and we can scale this up. And we can see that that is tracking to the surface of the terrain. Now, again, I don't really need those for this effect. I just need those tracker points. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of both of those. However, again, if you do add something to the scene, make sure you turn that camera back on. So I'm going to select my drone footage. And what I'm going to do now is actually duplicate it 2 times. So with that clip selected, I'll just come up here to edit and just come down here to duplicate. And the shortcut for that is Control-D or Command-D if you're on a Mac. And I'm just going to do that as well. So now you can see I have 3 copies of that drone footage. And now I'm going to hold Shift and I'm going to select 2 of those. And I'm going to pre-compose these together. So come up here to Layer and then pre-compose. We're just going to call this Trackers. And move all attributes into a new composition and then click OK. Now let's go ahead and jump into that Trackers comp. So I'm just going to double click on it. And once we're inside of there, I'm going to select the top copy of the drone footage. And what we want to do here is we want to set the render track points here to be on, so now we can see those points. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the mode for this footage to be difference. And you can see now how that's kind of isolated those tracker points on black, so we can overlay them on our footage. And we can do some other stylization effects to these tracker points. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. I'm just going to select that and I'm going to name that color tint. And on that adjustment layer, I'm going to apply the effect and then color correction tint. And that's just going to make those points be black and white. If you want to change them to another color, you can easily do that with the map white 2. Just go ahead and select it and you can go ahead and change it to any color you want. I'm just going to leave it to be black and white and click OK. Now to brighten these up a little bit, I may add a curves effect. So I'm going to do effect and then color correction and curves. And I'm just going to brighten those points up just so they show up a little bit better. Now I actually like the way these trackers look on our footage, kind of the standard appearance of the trackers in After Effects. However, if you want to change them, maybe give them a little bit more of a digital vibe, we can use the mosaic effect. So again, with that adjustment layer selected, I'm going to come here to Effect. And I'm going to come down here to Stylize, and I'm going to select the mosaic effect. And it's going to make them disappear, but we need to dial in some horizontal and vertical blocks. So I'm just going to type in here 384 by 216. And that'll make those square. You can see it just kind of blurs them out a little bit so they're not quite as uniform and just gives them a little bit more of a digital appearance. So let's jump back here to the main composition. And I'm going to select the trackers comp and I'm going to set the blending mode here to be add. So now we can see those points are now on top of our footage and they're kind of isolated on their own layers, so we're going to use that a little bit later. However, before we do anything else, what we need to do is we need to parent the trackers comp to the drone footage. That's because we're going to rescale this drone footage and we want the tracker markers to stick to it and rescale with it. So I'm going to go ahead and scale up the drone footage so it looks more like it's shot on a telephoto lens, like it is like a spy drone. So I'm going to select the footage, hit S on the keyboard for scale. I'm just going to scale that up a little bit. And it really doesn't matter if the quality kind of gets degraded because again, on this style, we're trying to make this look really authentic and the footage is going to be kind of grainy and muddy anyway. So it's really not going to affect things in the long run here with this. Now after we scaled that up, I'm actually going to turn off the visibility here of the trackers just by checking off the eyeball there. And I want to reposition this so that the Jeep is kind of in the center of this composition throughout. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm going to come over here to the title action safe and I'm going to check that on. That's going to give us just a little bit of a target here in the middle so we can kind of see where the center is. So I'm just going to select my drone footage. I'm going to hit P on the keyboard for position. I'm going to create a keyframe and I'm just going to move this to be in the center. Then I'm just going to briefly move through the footage, again just ensuring the Jeep is somewhere near the center. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can just go through just subtly adjusting this. Then after I've done that, I'm going to select all of these keyframes. And when I have them all selected, I'm going to hold Control or Command on a Mac and just click on one of them. And that's going to smooth all those out. It's going to auto Bezier those keyframes. And again, just ensuring that the Jeep is in the center. However, if we want to add a little extra element to this, we can add a subtle shake onto this to kind of emulate this is like being shot from a helicopter. So with the position down on the stopwatch here, I'm going to hold Alt and I'm going to click on that stopwatch. And we can type in an expression. We're just going to use the standard wiggle expression. So I'm going to type in wiggle. And then I'm going to do open parentheses. And I'm going to do 2, 10, and then close parentheses. And so twice per second, this is going to move 10 pixels. Again, just giving us a little extra subtle shake. And so now we can kind of see it's just a slight shake on that just to emulate that helicopter. And then if you want to as well, you can come down here and you can check on that footage for motion blur. And we can turn that on for the composition as well. And that'll just help emulate that a little bit more realistically. Now let's go ahead and turn back on the tracker's composition. And what I like to do is have this appear at a few different times throughout this clip. And so I might have this kind of pop on screen maybe around 2.5 seconds or so. And so what I'm going to do on that tracker's clip, I'm going to just get on the front of it and you'll see this double arrow up here. And I'm just going to trim this clip. So I'm just pulling it and I'm going to trim it to about right there. Again, I'm making sure I'm not actually selecting. You see, I'm not actually moving the clip. I'm just trimming it. So I'll move down and let this be on screen for a second or two. And then what I want to do here is I actually want to split the clip. So what I'm going to do with that composition selected, I'll come up here to Edit and then Split Layer. You can see the shortcut for that is Control-Shift-D or Command-Shift-D if you're on a Mac. So I'm going to select that and we're going to split that clip. And then again, I'm going to trim this up again, just pulling it down. I'll have it reappear somewhere around 8 seconds or so. And then when we get to the end of this, I'm just going to select the back half of it and trim that up as well. So basically what we've done is we've split that into 2 layers and we now just have 2 different areas where that kind of pops up on the screen. We're going to do some things to accent that visually so it looks a little bit cooler when it appears, but we'll get to that here in just a little bit. So now I want to make our footage appear black and white, and we're going to do that using the tint effect. Before we do, I'm going to turn off the title action safe, and I'm actually going to lock this drone footage here just so I don't accidentally click it and select it throughout the rest of the tutorial. So I'm going to right click now in the gray area and I'm going to select a new adjustment layer. And I'll just select that, rename it Color Tint. And with that selected, we'll come over to Effect and go down to Color Correction and Tint. So that'll make it black and white. Let's go ahead and add a Curves effect as well. So Effect, Color Correction, and Curves. And I'm just going to add a little bit more contrast onto this footage. So now let's go ahead and create the kind of loading screen effect that happens at the beginning of the preview. You saw where it's kind of blocking, it like loads in. And this is really easy to create. What we're going to do is we're going to right click, do a new adjustment layer. And I'll just name this Loading. And then with that adjustment layer selected, I'll come over to Effect. We're going to come down to Stylize again, and we're going to select the CC Block Load effect. And when we select that, everything's going to disappear temporarily. What we need to do is come over to the effect and check off the Start Cleared. And now you kind of see we get a mosaic type of loading screen effect. And if I'm going to set these scans here to be 6, I'll just demonstrate what this effect does. So you can see currently we're at 0, and it's from a scale from 0 to 100. But watch what happens as I kind of increase this over time. You'll see we kind of get this loading effect. It emulates kind of like the zoom and enhance feature you see on a lot of cheesy TV shows. It's a really nice way to add a little bit more interest and accent various elements on this scene. So what I'm going to do is at the very beginning of my composition, I'm going to check on the completion there at 0. And I'm going to move down here about 1 second. And we'll set this all the way up to 100. And then I'm going to hit U on the keyboard. And we can see those 2 keyframes. I'm going to trim that adjustment layer back down. So it's really only over those. That way we just kind of know what area that's covering. And I'm going to do a quick RAM preview here by pushing 0 on the numeric keypad. And we can see what this looks like. And there we can see it's just a quick visual accent there. Kind of like that digital transmissions coming through. It's also something that really works well with adding in a sound effect, just because it kind of gives you that visual cue. Next, let's go ahead and add a subtle distortion effect as well. So I'm going to right click and do a new adjustment layer. and we'll just call this Distort. And then with that adjustment layer selected, I'm going to come up to Effect and then Distort. We're going to do Optics Compensation. And I'm going to go ahead and check on to reverse the lens distortion. And then you'll see as I increase this, it just kind of gives us a little bit more of a visual depth onto this. And I like to keyframe this over time, just so it just, again, almost like it's a lens adjusting or just kind of focusing things into view. So I'm going to set this to be around 50. We're going to move to the very beginning of the comp. And then I'm actually going to move the distortion comp below the loading screen so it doesn't affect that. That stays straight. And I'll go ahead and create a keyframe here at 50, and we'll move down about 2 seconds and set this down to 0. Now this will be very subtle at the very start of this because again the loading screen is kind of covering it up, but you'll kind of feel it more than you actually notice it. I'm going to go ahead and RAM preview this. Again, it's something that's very subtle, but the more of these small subtle things we add onto this footage, the more they're going to kind of add up to really comprise the entire shot. And we're going to use that distortion effect again a little bit later on. So I'm actually going to select that. I'm going to hit U on the keyboard. I'm going to trim that up as well, just so we kind of know what area that's working over. Next, let's go ahead and add some scan lines on top of this footage. Now, the quick and easy way to do this, if we come over to the project, with the project file, I've included some military camera assets here, and we have some scan lines. And I'm going to select scan lines 2, and I'm just going to drag and drop it at the very top of my footage. And I'll zoom in here, and you can see those scan lines. We can set this to be in overlay mode, blending mode. And now you can see how that kind of looks. Again, it's just going to muddy up, kind of digitize this footage, as you can see here. It looks really nice over the loading screen. You can see over the squares there as that loads, just really giving it that digital look. Now, if you want to create your own scan lines, it's super simple to do. So just come over here and click on a new composition. We'll just call this scan lines, and I'm gonna go ahead and click OK. And just in here, I'm gonna right click and do a new solid. I'll make it be white, make it comp size, go ahead and click OK. And then on that solid, we're gonna apply the effect of Venetian blinds. I'm just going to search for blinds over here, and you'll see Venetian blinds under transition. I'm just going to apply this to that solid, and under transition completion, I'm going to set it to be 50%, and now you can start to see what's happening. And on direction, I'm going to set it to be 90 degrees, and the width will adjust the size of the scan lines here, and then you can also feather them if you want to soften them up. But that's a quick way you can create your own. You can go ahead and just render out a still frame and drag and drop that in just like I did for the other asset ones. So I'm going to go ahead and close that up because we're using the ones from the assets. And I want the scan lines to be at the very top of this composition layer stack. And I'm not going to use this really anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and lock that up just so we don't accidentally move that later on. Now I also want to have kind of like a scanning band of like brightness through here where it just kind of goes over the footage. Again, just something else to accent it. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. And we'll just call this bright band. And then on that, I'm just going to do effect, color correction, curves. I'm just going to brighten this up. And what I'm going to do, I'll show you, zoom out here. I'm going to select that adjustment layer. I'm just going to select the top part. I'm just going to move it up. It's going to just kind of scale it here vertically. And I'm going to move down to about 2 seconds or so. What I want to do is I'm going to select that adjustment layer, hold it shift. I'm going to move this up above all the footage, just right out of frame. And I'm going to hit P on the keyboard for position, create a keyframe. And I'm just going to move down here in time, maybe to the very end, and I'll just move this all the way off the screen. So it's just something that's going to subtly and slowly move through over the screen, just accenting, giving another extra visual on top of everything. You can see that there. And you could add in more of these if you wanted to, or you could actually apply the Venetian blinds effect to this if you wanted multiple ones. It's just something very simple, and again, it's just going to accent nice. One other thing I did on the original shot was add in a vignette. So let's right click, do a new adjustment layer. And I'll just call this Vin. And then with that adjustment layer selected, we'll do another curve. So effect, color correction, curves. And then I'm going to pull this down so it's darkening it up. And with that adjustment layer selected, we'll come here to the mask and I'm going to select the ellipse tool. So just double click to create a circle mask. I'm going to set it to be subtract. Then under the mask options here, let's set the feather to be 200 pixels. It's just going to feather that out. Again, just kind of adding more depth. So I'm going to close that back up. Now we can kind of start to create some of the HUD elements that are on screen here, like they're from the camera. And so what I like to do, it's really simple, it's just an outline area. And we're going to do that with this stroke effect. But first, we need to create a solid to apply that to. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new solid. And what I want this to be, I want it to be a little bit smaller than our actual composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select in here. I'm just going to type in 1920 and then -100. And click over here and just gonna make this 100 pixels smaller around all the edges. So I'm gonna do the same thing on 1080, so negative 100. As you can see, so it's 1820 by 980, and I'll just call this box, and go ahead and click OK. And with that on screen now, with it selected, let's come back up here to the mask tool. I'm gonna select the rectangle tool, and I'm just gonna double click. And that's gonna create a square mask around everything here, just around the edges, and that's what we need for the stroke effect to work. So with that box selected, come here to Effect, and then Generate, and then we're gonna select the stroke effect. And right now we don't see any difference, but let's come over here to Paint Style and change this to be on transparent. So now you can see that edge, and we can increase the brush size. So you can see that here. So I'm just gonna have this be completely square around this, but you could mask this out and do various other shapes. Another effect that's kind of similar to this is gonna be the grid effect. So if we come out to Effect and then Generate, you'll see the grid effect. So it works very similarly if you wanna create these HUD type elements. Now, one thing that's really important is I wanna make this look as if it's really blended in to this scene, like it's a part of it. And right now it's definitely too clean and too sharp. So if we just look at this, it's really bright. Doesn't look like it kind of matches this color profile, and it's way too sharp. So what we're gonna do to soften this up, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move the box below these scan lines. I'm also gonna move the vignette and the bright band below the scan lines. I want the scan lines to be on top. But on the box, what I wanna do is I wanna soften this up. So let's go over here to Effect and then Blur, and we're gonna do a Gaussian blur. And I'll zoom in here so you can see what's gonna happen here when I start to blur this out. You're gonna see as I increase the blur, it's gonna start to uniform to those kind of scan lines you can see. It just really matches with the composite a lot better, and looks like it fits a lot more. And if the current white is a little too bright, I may come over here to the color and just drop this to be a little bit more of an off-white. Now you can kind of see how that blends, just matching into this scene a lot more. Something else you can do is I'm gonna hit T on the keyboard for opacity, and you can lower the opacity of that as well. Again, just making this look like it fits, keeping it subtle, is going to go a long way to really matching the visual aesthetic. And one of the elements that's included with the assets is going to be this square corner. So I'm just going to pull this in and put it above the box layer. And you can see this is just some subtle square corners. And you could create this yourself using the stroke effect with some masks, or you can just drag and drop this into your scene. And you can also soften them back up with more blur if you wanted to match your composite. But I just want to add that to the center of this scene. And now we want to go ahead and create that kind of center square cutout that's a little bit more zoomed in. And so the way we're going to do that is I'm going to right click, and we're going to do a new adjustment layer. And then I'm going to call this Zoom. And then on that adjustment layer, we're going to apply the effect. And under Distort, we're going to select Transform. And before we make any changes, what I actually want to do on the zoom is I'm going to hit S on the keyboard for scale. And I want to scale it down so it's somewhere kind of inside of these four corners here. So I'm just going to scale that down. You can kind of see that on screen. It'll be a little easier in just a second when we start adjusting things. But I'm going to zoom in here. So I'm going to set this to be around 42. Fits right in those corner areas. And what we're going to do with the transform effect is we can increase the scale here. So you can see as I increase this, it's like it's cutting it out and just increasing wherever that's over. So we can set this to be around 140. And you can see it's just going to give us a nice kind of visual parallax on the footage. For the Jeep, I'm actually increase this to 150. But it's kind of like that's the most important part of the frame. It's just zooming in. Again, just making it look a little more complicated. We're going to do a couple other things to enhance this in just a moment. So now we can go ahead and add in a target. So if you want to create your own target in the center, you can. But if we go to the project assets, I've got a target here. I'm just going to drag and drop this in. I'm going to put it under the zoom. You can put it above or below, but I'll show you why I'm doing that in just a second. But once I've got that into the composition, I'm going to go ahead and select it. I'm going to go to Layer and then pre-compose that. And we'll just call this target. And we're going to move all attributes into a new composition and click OK. Now let's go ahead and double click inside the target comp. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select all the other target layers in this asset pack. I'm going to hold Shift. And I'm just going to drag those and place them below the target one. And I'll show you why I'm doing that. You can see you can actually create your own target look with all these. You can turn them on and make various combinations to create your own unique targets. And you can kind of see that here, what I'm doing. And if you want to change the color of them, you can easily do that. Select one of them, come up here to Effect, go to Generate, and then Fill. And then you can change the color of the target if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave on target 1. Now let's jump back over to the main composition. And so what I want to do here is I'm going to hit S on the keyboard on that target composition. I'm going to scale this down quite a bit. And you can see it's underneath the zoom layer. But now that we've scaled that down, I'm going to zoom in here on that, and you can see the target's definitely a little too sharp and a little too bright. So with that layer selected, I'm going to come here to Effect, and then come down to Blur, and then Gaussian Blur. We'll increase that. We'll see it kind of blur into those scan lines a lot more. And then if you want to adjust the color tint, just come here to Effect, and we'll go to Generate again and Fill. And we can change this color. I'm going to set it to be just an off-white. And zoom out here now, we can see that target on the footage. Now the reason I placed that target layer below the zoom layer is because we're actually going to split that into 3 different zooms. So on the zoom adjustment layer, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to find probably just after these trackers disappear the first time. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to Control-Shift-D, Command-Shift-D on a Mac to split that zoom. And I'm going to do that one more time a little bit further down. We'll do it again right after the second time the trackers disappear. I'll do Control-Shift-D on that as well. So now we have 3 different zoom layers, and what we can do on this middle copy is I'm going to select it, and we're going to apply quite a few different effects onto this, really kind of building this look up. So what I'm going to do with that selected is I'm going to come here to Effect, then we're going to go to Channel, and we're going to select Invert. So we're going to change this to be more of like a thermal heat map look. And you can see when we did that, it also inverted our target, which is below that layer. So it turned that to be black. And so I want to contrast this a little bit more. So I'm going to add a curves effect onto this as well. So color correction curves. And I'll just darken this down. Just kind of giving that more of that thermal look. Now something else I like to do on this as well is I'm going to apply the optics compensation effect. So come back up to Distort. And we'll select optics compensation. Check on reverse lens distortion. And we're going to increase the field of view here quite a bit. You're going to see how it's going to kind of pull up the edges of that. And this will give it a pretty unique look as it kind of moves around on the footage. Just really looking like the camera's in a totally different mode. I may actually increase this to be like 140. So it's pretty extreme. And one other thing we can do is do the CC block load effect on this as well. So we'll move right at the beginning of when that changes on this adjustment layer, and we'll do Effect. And then under Stylize, we'll do CC block load. I'm gonna go ahead and close up some of these other effects just so we can see this a little bit easier. And on CC block load, let's go ahead and uncheck Start Cleared, change the scans to be 6. And we'll just do a keyframe at the very beginning of that adjustment layer. We'll move down very quickly, like a second, and pull this all the way up to 100. So again, this will just give us that visual cue when this change occurs. So let's go ahead and RAM preview this and see kind of what this looks like when it changes. All right, so hopefully now you can start to see how all these effects are adding up and really building to create this look, and it looks quite nice as far as when that cue happens, and that'd be a good place to put in a sound effect or digital glitch or something clicking. Now, as I mentioned before, I like to use kind of the optics compensation effect whenever something changes as well. So I'm gonna move down here to right at the end of where the second tracker group disappears. And I'm gonna come down here to the distort layer we created in the beginning. I'm gonna go ahead and Control-D to duplicate that. I'll hit U on the keyboard. I'm gonna move the second keyframe a lot closer, and I'll just trim this one up. And I'm just gonna move this now down in the timeline to kind of appear, again, just right after those trackers disappear. So right about here is where I want that to start. And I'm gonna select that. I'm gonna increase this field of view quite a bit. And this is just going to give us a nice kind of visual cue that something has changed as well. You can see when that swipes through there. And if that's not quite enough, something else we could do is I might actually right click and just do a new adjustment layer and just have this be like 1 frame in size. So I'm going to call this just darken. And I'll just trim this adjustment layer up just so it's really 1 frame over this point. And I'll do Effect, Color Correction Curves. Darken this up a lot. You'll kind of see, let's do a quick ramp preview of this, and you can kind of see the visual that this creates. You can see it's almost just like it pinged again, changing into a different camera mode. Finally, one last thing I recommend doing on top of this footage is to add some grain. It's just gonna, again, help blend everything together and make it more kind of visually correct. I do wanna say, if you are gonna upload this footage onto YouTube and you do add this grain, make sure you export the video at a very high bit rate, because otherwise, if it's a low bit rate, the grain is going to kind of muddy up the image a little bit more unintentionally, and it'll look kind of muddy when you upload it to YouTube as well. So just keep that in mind. Now there's 2 ways we can add grain to this. I'm going to right click, and we're going to do a new adjustment layer. And I'm just going to move this to the very top below the scan lines. I'll just name it grain. And with that selected, come here to Effect. Again, there's 2 different ways. If we go to Noise and Grain, the first is going to be Add Grain. Now this one's going to look the best, but it's going to render much slower because it's really a realistic grain effect. Just come over here to the viewing mode and change this to be final output. And then I'm going to come down here to color and change it to be monochromatic. Now if I zoom in here, you can see the grain on the footage, especially if I increase the intensity. This is going to look the best again, but it's going to render much slower. That's pretty intense, but I wanted to crank it up so you could see this with the compression of the tutorial. But what I actually did for the original preview, I'm going to delete that. I just used the typical noise effect. So under noise and grain, I'm going to select noise. I'm going to set the amount to be 20. And I'm going to check off the use color noise. So again, this is just some extra grain here. And it just shows up on kind of the darker and bright white areas to give it some nice contrast. Alright guys, hopefully you enjoyed creating this military drone look inside of After Effects. Also, be sure to check out the other motion graphic tutorials that are available for free on RocketStock's blog. This has been Charles Yeager for RocketStock. Thanks for watching.